All right, friends and neighbors, welcome, welcome. I see we are getting a whole bunch of people coming in at the last minute, which is not uncommon for business leaders like yourself. So I'm going to go ahead and start my introduction. We'll give folks just a few more minutes to log on, and then we will formally begin. So I'd like to start by saying good morning to you all. My name is Christine, and I am with WCF Workers' Compensation Insurance Company. I'd like to welcome you and, of course, offer very special thanks to Paso Robles Wine Country Alliance, the Arroyo Seco Wine Growers Association, the Santa Barbara Vintners for bringing us all together for this amazingly critical safety issue. This morning I was checking local weather in Paso and Friends forecasts. Well, they call for temps over 107 degrees through Friday of next week, with Tuesday expected to pop up in at a blistering 112. So it's a poorly timed joke, I'm sure, but you could say that heat illness safety training, well, it's a really hot topic these days. And frankly, one that did not even exist for tasting room staff until only a few weeks ago. The brainchild of this event is my dear friend, Kevin Lynn. He is a vice president with DeBudo and Defendus Insurance Beverage Group, and he loves everything about wine. Several weeks ago, Kevin was wine tasting in a Paso winery in a freshly set up outdoor tasting room, much as all of you probably have now, and observed tasting room staff running back and forth between tasting room and new outdoor tasting room. It was 103 degrees that day. Kevin asked a staff member how it seemed to be going, and she showed him her pedometer. It read 7.1 miles. 7.1 miles in 103-degree heat. So many of you are already DeBudo and Defendus Insurance clients, and a big warm welcome to you. We would love to invite those of you who are not our clients yet to consider having an insurance conversation with Kevin Lynn, because of the service that he's providing with us today. And well, it's just the tip of the iceberg. And again, a poorly timed joke, but doesn't an iceberg sound really good right about now? Kevin stood this training for us up in about 3 weeks, and it reached everybody he could possibly find. For today's event, I would like to introduce our speaker. McKell Sanderson is a safety and health consultant with WCF Workers' Compensation Insurance. He has been in the risk management field of environmental health and safety since 2009. He's a certified safety professional, a certified hazardous materials manager, a construction health and safety technologist, and an associate in risk management. McKell joins us with a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering, a master's degree in environmental engineering, and is a PhD candidate in occupational health and safety. Please welcome McKell Sanderson.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that welcome. My name is McKell Sanderson. I'm going to be talking to you about heat safety for supervisors. Sorry, got a little bit ahead of myself there. But as we go through this, I'm hoping that you'll be able to kind of look at this agenda and answer the, what's in this for me question. It's really important for adult learners and making sure that you understand that there is some value here. So if you can't address it during this agenda, if you don't see anything there, I promise we'll get to some stuff at the end that will have an impact. Just to quickly let you know what this training will cover, we're going to discuss what heat illnesses are common, what they are, why this matters, what you can do about it, and what you're required to do about it according to Cal OSHA. I'm hoping for a few minutes at the end to have time for some questions, but if you have a question while we go through this, please type it in the chat, and Christine will make sure that I don't miss it as we go through this. All right. So as it turns out, the human body, for all its adaptability, it really just likes 98.6 degrees. It does not handle temperature extremes very well at all. When the temperature gets hot outside, it's really easy for your body's natural cooling systems to become overrun, and your core temperature begins to rise. As your core temperature begins to rise, some bad things can start to happen. right? I'm curious why you all signed up for this brief training. This is, as Christine mentioned, it's not something that's really been a focus for wineries and wine tasting groups and things like that in the past, but with these times that we're in, it's kind of forced everybody outside and everyone else is getting to deal with the heat. If you don't have any reason, if you just think, I just have to take this, let me offer you some compliance-based compelling reasons, right? The following statement comes from Cal OSHA. As an employer, you are responsible for the working conditions of your employees, so you must act effectively when conditions result in sudden exposure to heat that your workers are not used to. Thus, you have the responsibility to determine how your company will be vigilant with your employees to recognize immediately symptoms of possible heat illness, notify emergency services in the event of an emergency and a plan to do so, ensure that all employees and supervisors are trained before beginning work that should reasonably be anticipated to result in a heat illness. So in English, this simply means that you're responsible to create a safe work environment for your employees. That safe work environment should be free of recognized hazards, and OSHA has repeatedly enforced that heat is a recognized hazard. So if we know it's going to be hot, we know there's going to be an exposure to heat, we need to make sure that we take steps to make sure we can deal with that safely. So as we look at different types of heat illness, I'll briefly kind of tell you how to recognize these. I'm also a certified CPR and first aid instructor, and so I teach heat illness first aid quite frequently. So I'll give you a couple examples of what to look for and then how to treat each of these four common types of heat illnesses that are out there, right? The first, and we'll address these in order from least severity to most severe, right? So the first is heat rash. It looks like small blisters or small pimples or just a rash. It's generally it's just uncomfortable, and it tends to occur in places where clothing rubs against skin or where skin rubs against skin. So the primary locations for this tend to be the back of the neck, on the chest, the groin, underneath the breast, elbows or knees, you know, in the creases of elbows and knees. And how you treat heat rash, you want to wash and clean it with soap and water. Just make sure the area is nice and clean, and then allow that to air dry. You want to avoid patting it or rubbing it with a towel, anything like that. If the person's still uncomfortable, it's okay to apply calamine lotion and then have the person dress in lightweight, non-abrasive clothing so that it avoids rubbing there. The next one we'll discuss is heat cramps. Heat cramps, you want the biggest telltale sign for heat cramps besides someone actually falling to the ground and grabbing their leg or something like that tends to be heavy sweating. So look for heavy sweating, especially during labor-intensive tasks. Watch for muscle spasms or people indicating pain as they walk. Most heat cramps tend to occur in the legs, so in the thighs or the calves. And what we do to treat this, we want to stop the task and let's get the person to a shaded, cool place and have them drink plenty of fluids. You're required to provide them at least water, but for heat cramps, one of the things that is important is replenishing the electrolytes, and that's usually best accomplished with commercial sports drinks like Gatorade or Powerade, something to that effect. The next one is heat exhaustion. And with heat exhaustion, we want to watch for heavy sweating. Heavy sweating and then nausea or vomiting is common with this as well. If you suspect heat exhaustion, check the person's skin. In heat exhaustion,
are you taking stuff down?
In heat exhaustion, it's common for the skin to be cold, pale, and clammy. It's common for the skin to be cold, pale, or clammy. A fast, weak pulse is also common. So like think about a mouse a really fast but weak pulse is common for heat exhaustion. Some questions you can ask the person if they feel tired or weak or dizzy. They may complain of a headache, and some even pass out or faint. Heat exhaustion can be serious. So what we want to do, we want to move them to a cool place, loosen their clothing, and apply a cool, wet compress. So, wet a towel or a rag and apply that to places like the neck, the forehead, other parts of the body. Let them sip water slowly. If they complain of, if they're complaining of a very severe headache, or they're vomiting, or anything like that, call 911, right? For heat stroke occurs when the body temperature when your core temperature exceeds 102 degrees. So it's typically characterized by hot, red, flushed skin. It may be dry or it may be damp. It can be either, but it'll be hot and red. A fast, strong pulse with this, and then these people have a headache and they're usually nauseous. The ultimate sign for heat stroke, though, is altered mental status. So they'll start to say things that don't make sense. Sometimes they will slur their words. They'll be different, things like that. And commonly they'll pass out. Heat stroke is a medical emergency, so you want to call 911 right away. Move the person to a cooler place, loosen their clothing. In first aid, the best method that they teach is to immerse the person up to their neck in cold water to really get their temperature down. Since most people don't have, bathtubs around for that, try and fan them, cool them down any way that you can. If they're responsive, you can offer them something to drink. Never give a non-responsive person anything to drink. And don't force them to drink in the case of heat exhaustion. If they don't want to, sometimes they'll get violent. And other times, when their core temperature gets high enough, it's called esophageal paralysis, and they're unable to swallow, so they may not want to drink because they just don't feel like they can. If you call 911 and recognize it early, heat stroke, it has about a 90% survival rate. So chances are they'll be okay, but even so, 1 in 10 will still die, even if you do everything right. So the key for heat stroke is preventing it from occurring in the first place. So that's what we're going to talk about. Sorry, next slide. As we go through this, preventing heat illness. So when it comes to preventing heat illness, there are a few simple steps that you can take. We'll discuss these all more in detail, but just to give you a quick overview, you're required to provide access to water. You're required to provide access to shade. When feasible, you're required to provide a place to get out of the heat. And just spoiler alert for you, it's almost always feasible. Feasible to OSHA means technologically possible. They don't talk about whether it's financially possible, just if the technology exists for you to do that. So it's almost always feasible according to OSHA, right? Additionally, you should do things like watch the weather, because a lot of the requirements are based on expected temperatures. So if the temperature forecast shows that it will exceed 80 degrees, then your plan has to be in place so that you're ready for the weather to be above 80 degrees. And we'll talk about some of that. Certain industries have high heat procedures that they're required to do. The good news is those don't apply to you guys, but we'll discuss what some of those are, just so you have an idea of what the best practices are. You're also required to have employee and supervisory training related to heat illness, and then written procedures, including what to do when there's an emergency for heat illness, right? So let's talk a little bit about access to water, right? So potable drinking water must be made available at no cost to the employee. People always ask me how much water. The standard requires that you provide at least 1 quart per employee per hour for the entire shift. All right. So for an 8-hour shift, you have to provide 2 gallons of water for each employee, at least 2 gallons of water for each employee that will work an 8-hour shift. Water must be fit to drink. Water containers cannot be refilled from non-potable water sources like irrigation wells, sprinklers, firefighting systems, anything like that. And then care must be taken to prevent contamination of the drinking water. So if you look at that third picture on the right, you can't have just a cup, like an old rusty can or something like that, that people are going to dip in there and pour out. It needs to come out through a spout, all of that. Most places just provide bottled water, or they'll have a sink where employees can go and get cool water. It's really, really crucial that you remind workers not to wait until they're thirsty. So encourage the frequent drinking of water. For shade, when temperatures exceed 80 degrees, you're required to provide shade. The requirements of shade are it must provide a blockage of direct sunlight. It must be provided when temperatures exceed 80 degrees, as I mentioned. It has to be large enough to accommodate all employees resting, and it has to be used. It has to be able to be used to take preventative cool down rest breaks. So if someone in certain industries, they're required to have a 10-minute break every 2 hours to get out of the sun, that doesn't apply to you, but it's a good idea. And they need to be able to take their breaks in the shade. Right, some high heat procedures. So high heat procedures, these are only applicable by the standard. They only apply to agriculture, construction, landscaping, oil and gas extraction, and transportation or delivery of agricultural construction materials or other heavy materials, right? These are kicked in when the temperature equals or exceeds 95 degrees. So high heat procedures, they don't apply to your industry. However, they are considered to be a best practice. And so we'll just tell you what they require, all right? There's 5 things that they require depending on the industry. So first, you have to ensure effective communication, either by voice or observation or telephone or some kind of technological means. Second, you have to observe employees for alertness and signs or symptoms of heat illness. I suggest you do this anyway, even though you don't have a requirement to do this, because if you do have a heat illness injury, it's really easy for OSHA to come out and say, hey, someone should have been watching them. Even though the standard doesn't spell that out, they get you with their general duty clause. You're responsible to provide that environment free from recognized hazards, right? So if you do observe employees, OSHA requires that a supervisor or the designated observer can't watch more than 20 employees alone. So you have to have at least 1 supervisor for every 20 employees to be able to watch this. In certain industries, they require a buddy system be implemented. And that's where you just put workers in pairs and they watch each other to make sure that if one of them starts to show signs or symptoms of heat illness, the other one calls for help, right? Third requirement is designate 1 or more employees to call emergency services. If there's emergency, you just have to have someone that is your designated 911 caller. If there's something wrong, they're going to be the one that activates this emergency medical services. Fourth, you have to hold pre-shift meetings on prevention of heat illness. I recommend you do this anyway, even though it's not required in the standard for your industry. But just before people go out, just remind them, hey, it's going to be hot today. Make sure you drink plenty of water, take your breaks when you need it. Just something to remind them, hey, we know it's hot. We want you to be aware that we've taken precautions for that. All right, and then the 5th one only applies to agriculture. but you have to ensure employees take a minimum 10-minute net preventative cool down rest every 2 hours. And then if they work an 8 or a 10-hour shift, they have to have an additional 10-minute break at the end of the 8th hour and 10th hour, right? Those are considered best practices. I would recommend you implement those that are that make sense to you with those, right? Emergency response procedures. OSHA requires that you have an emergency response plan that addresses any reasonable hazards that you could have, including heat illness. The big things that they look for with this and what you want to ensure that you have effective communication. Make sure that your employees are trained on who should call 911, when they should call 911, and all of those procedures. Who's going to call, and it's really important for this that 911 knows how to get to where the emergency is. So you should have a plan in place for how someone will give directions to the exact location. If you're not on a public street, you know, if you have people that are out in the middle of the vineyard or something like that, where it's difficult to get help there, right? You also need to make sure that people are trained on the signs and symptoms. Your employees need to be able to recognize that, and they need to know how to notify a supervisor. Supervisors need to be able to take immediate, appropriate action. They need to be able to make that decision without having to call someone else. If there's indicators of a heat illness, you need to call 911. And then I mentioned make sure that there's precise, directions to the site. I saw a question in the comments: how do you deal with employees that are heavy smokers during heat events? To address that, part of that, it comes in this employee training, and I'll talk about that right now. So the next sentence that I'm going to say comes directly from Cal OSHA, and it says employees must be trained on the environmental and personal risk factors for heat illness, as well as the added burden of heat load on the body, right? So personal risk factors, that includes things like heavy smokers, things like that. Personal risk factors can also include water consumption, previous alcohol consumption or alcohol consumption, the degree of acclimatization, so how used they are to the heat, caffeine consumption, use of prescription medications, age, weight, health, even their ethnic identity can come into play for how well their personal risk factors are for the heat. You can't discriminate against them. You can't give someone different tasks because of their personal risk factors, but you need to make sure that you're aware of those personal risk factors and that the employee is trained on what makes them a higher risk, such as being a heavy smoker, or the big one that happens a lot in construction is people will drink the night before, and then when they come to work, their body, they start dehydrated. So it's important to just encourage them to keep drinking water. Environmental risk factors that we have to talk about: you need to talk to the employees about how temperature, humidity, radiant heat from sunlight and other sources like equipment, conductive heat sources such as the ground, wind speed or air movement, workload severity, workload duration, the type of clothing they're wearing, and what personal protective equipment. All of those things come into play for how your environment will affect your body's ability to get rid of that excess heat. Additionally, you have to talk to them about the burden of heat on the body. And really that's kind of one sentence, right? If your body is too hot, you just have to explain what happened. Heat rash, heat cramps, heat exhaustion, heat stroke, and eventually death. Make sure that your employees know about those. The ones that they specifically ask about when Cal OSHA comes on site, they usually will just pick an employee that's working out in the sun and they'll say, hey, tell me what you know about heat exhaustion. Tell me what you know about heat stroke. They want to know if the person knows how to recognize it and knows how to treat it, what to do in that event. Right? Some more employee training. You have to train your employees on your company's specific heat illness prevention procedures. Right? This includes, but is not limited to, the employer's responsibility to provide shade, water, and rest. So everything that I've talked to you about, you have to make sure your employees are aware of. As well, you also have to tell the employee about their rights under the heat standard and their ability to exercise those rights without retaliation. The surest way to get in trouble with employee training with OSHA is to tell them, hey, tell your employees, hey, these are your rights, but if you ever call OSHA, we're going to kick you out the door, kind of thing. You'll get in trouble, a lot of trouble for that. Additionally, you have to train them on the importance of the frequent consumption of small quantities of water. All right. Basically, what they want you to do is tell them that it's more important that they drink a quart of water every hour. That's more important than them drinking a gallon of water at lunch. All right. So just make sure that that they keep that in mind. Finally, you have to teach them specifically that heat illness can start out minor with something like heat rash, but it can progress really quickly given the environment. So you have to talk to them about the importance of recognizing heat illness early and getting help early before it progresses to something like heat stroke. And then you have to talk to them about acclimatization. This is the concept that you'll be able to work in the heat longer and better once you're used to working in the heat more. So the more time you spend out in the heat, the more your body acclimatizes to that and you get used to it. In California, this is a specific rule to California. Essentially what they want to see is that your heat plan addresses new employees or people who will be now working outside that haven't been, and how you're going to get them ready for that. Most of the time it involves giving new employees shorter shifts. So if they're going to be outside for 4 hours of their shift normally, the first 2 weeks, you're going to build them up to that. So 2.5 hours one day, then 3 hours the next day, 3.5 hours the next day, and then finally 4 hours, so that you build them up to that slowly. You just want to make sure that you have a plan that you can justify why you've done what you've done on that. You can also do it by saying, hey, we're just going to rotate our new employees out. They're going to take a break every hour instead of every 2 hours. Whatever your plan entails, you just have to make sure that your employees are trained on what that means. Right? Supervisor training. Supervisors have to be trained on the following. So they have to be trained on, basically it's this training that you're receiving, the heat standard requirements. You have to be trained on the procedures that that you're required to implement. This is just a fancy way to say your company's program, your personal company's program. Supervisors have to be trained how to implement that program. You have to be trained on procedures to follow when a worker exhibits or reports symptoms that are consistent with heat illness, including emergency response procedures and first aid. So you need to know what to do. And it doesn't have to be in depth, just like we talked about. Hey, this is how you recognize it. This is what you're going to do. Right. And then the other thing that's unique for supervisor training, you have to be taught how to monitor weather and how to respond to hot weather advisories. So this is directly from Cal OSHA. You must train your supervisors how to access and understand weather reports. The big things they need to understand with the weather report are where to get it and what that high temperature means, like, so they can kind of plan out, okay, at 2 o'clock, it's going to be the hottest it's going to be. We're going to try and minimize our work at 2 o'clock, just so you can make that informed decisions as a supervisor, right? As long as they're effective, you can have your written procedures be part of your injury and illness prevention plan, or IIPP. Cal OSHA requires that every company has an injury and illness prevention plan. If you don't have one, it'd be a good thing to talk with Kevin about. D&D does a great job of helping their customers get these up and running, and they produce some of the best ones that I've seen. So talk to Kevin about that. If you don't have an injury and illness prevention plan, if you do, make sure that your heat prevention plan is covered inside there. All right. This document, your heat injury prevention, you need to maintain the procedures. They need to be on site. So they need to be somewhere that employees have access to them. You can't have them locked in a drawer somewhere where they can't. They have to be made available to employees, and they also have to be made available to representatives from OSHA and Cal OSHA if they come in and request that. The plan, according to the standard, the plan has to be in English, and it has to be in the language that's understood by the majority of the employees. So if you have a lot of Latino workers, you also have to have a copy of your plan in Spanish. So standard requires that you have it in English, but you also have to have it for the majority of the workers if they're non-English speaking. A good rule of thumb is if you have someone that speaks another language as their primary language and they don't speak English very well, then you need to have the plan in their language, or at least provide training on the plan to them in their language, right? Your plan has to include details on how your company is going to meet the burden to provide access to shade and water, how you're going to monitor the weather. It doesn't apply to you, the high heat procedures, but you need to have best practices addressed in there. They specifically have to address acclimatization, how your plan and your training program for training all of your employees and your supervisors, and then how you will get somebody that needs treatment for heat illness, how you'll get them treat illness or heat illness resources right away, how you're going to get 911 there, how you're going to get them in the shade and provide them, sports drinks, whatever it is that you're going to do. You have to be able to have that documented in your plan. And then one thing that is required is there has to be clear and precise directions to the work site. So if someone does call 911, they can do that. For most establishments, just having the address, the street address, is sufficient. But if you do have a place where, hey, the street address takes you to the gate, but then there's multiple buildings, you need to be able to tell them how to get to whatever building it is. So here's one of the reasons why this is important for you guys to understand. So Cal OSHA considers heat illness a serious citation. Under the current rule, a serious citation can come with a fine of up to $130,125, and that's per violation per day. All right. So if you have multiple people that are getting hurt or experiencing things like heat exhaustion or even heat stroke, and that occurs multiple days, OSHA can cite you for each person that reaches that point and every day that they've done that. And usually if you have more than one or two, they're going to issue on the high end of that fine. So that citation can easily get up into the millions of dollars if you've had a whole bunch of days over 100 degrees. All right. So as Christine mentioned, I think for the next week, Paso is supposed to be in the 107 range or hotter. If you don't have these plans in place and you do have the misfortune of Cal OSHA deciding that they want to come out and check this, they could give you a serious citation, and they can go back and say, well, it was over 80 degrees all of these days, and you don't have any evidence that you ever provided shade or ever provided water or ever did anything that was required under the standard. Legally, they can go back and cite you up to $130,000 for every day that you didn't meet this standard, which is admittedly unfair, but that's that's what they can do. And generally, when it comes to worker safety, OSHA tends to cite first and then deal with it in the appeals process. So at best, you're going to end up in court trying to fight why you don't think that that was a fair assessment, right? If any of these required things, elements from your plan aren't covered in your plan, that can also be a serious citation. So if your plan doesn't address drinking water or providing shade or employee and supervisor training or emergency response procedures, any of those things, you could get cited up to 4 times for just your plan for every day. So quickly, this could become multi-million dollar citation. So it's very important that you take this serious. If you need help with these, reach out to Kevin. D&D provides a great service in helping put heat prevention plans in place. They do a great job with that. You could also get, in addition to these huge citations, there's also, it's called an OPU. It's an order prohibiting use. This also comes with a serious citation. So you're going to get that $130,000 fine in addition to the OPU. But the OPU, what it basically does is it will shut down the operation and work will not be allowed to resume until the employer demonstrates that the imminent hazard has been corrected. OPUs come if the temperature is over 95 and water, shade, training, or emergency procedures are not in place. Or they can come if the temperature is over 80 degrees and there's a heat wave that involves heavy workloads or other critical factors putting employees in danger. So if OSHA comes in and decides, hey, your operation is dangerous enough that it could result in a death, then they can do that citation and the OPU. And really what they do is they just shut you down. You're not legally allowed to do any work until you get that put back together. So it is quite an impact to your business, and it can be a significant disruption. So the biggest thing for heat prevention, teach your employees to look out for each other. We like to say at WCF Insurance, be careful out there. The best way to be careful out there for heat illness is to look out for each other. Have someone that's responsible for your health and safety, and you be responsible for someone else's. All right. This helps us always be on the lookout to make sure, hey, you know, I'm watching John and John's watching me. We're going to make sure that if any of us start showing any of these signs, that help is on the way.